Every morning, they painted the wall white again. Every night, someone put the stars back. The first thing Ethan Walker heard when he stepped into Sector 12 was not a voice. It was the soft, endless hum of failing heat pipes hidden behind steel panels. The sound vibrated through the narrow corridor like a tired heartbeat. Red emergency lights washed over the ceiling in slow pulses, turning the gray metal walls into dark shades of rust and shadow. Haven, 9 orbital refuge station, floated nearly 200 miles above Mars, carrying more than 20,000 displaced souls from worlds most people on Earth had never heard of. Some had lost homes. Some had lost countries. Some had lost entire skies. Ethan tightened the strap of his tool bag and followed the maintenance alert blinking on his wrist display. A thermal regulator had failed again. Third time this week. He wasn't surprised. Haven 9 had been built to last 20 years. It was entering year 32. Everything groaned. Everything leaked. Everything needed fixing, including people. Though Ethan knew better than to say that out loud. The corridor temperature read 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Too cold, especially for the children housed in the adjacent sleeping chambers. He knelt beside an access panel and removed the first set of screws. Metal clicked softly against the floor. Behind him, distant voices echoed through the station. Different languages, different species, different worlds. Yet somehow every tired voice sounded the same after midnight. He opened the panel and reached inside. A burst of cold air escaped. "There you are," he muttered. "One damaged circulation valve. Easy enough." He grabbed a replacement component from his kit and got to work. 20 minutes later, the system finally responded. Warm air began flowing through the pipes again. The regulator's warning light turned green. Ethan exhaled and leaned back against the wall. The silence felt heavier than usual. Then he noticed it. A faint scratching sound. Not mechanical. Not electrical. Slow. Careful. Almost deliberate. He turned toward the far end of the corridor. At first he saw nothing except shadows. Then another pulse of red. Light rolled across the hallway. Someone stood near the wall. Small. Motionless. Watching. Ethan rose slowly. The figure didn't move. He took several steps forward. The scratching sound continued. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. As he drew closer, he realized the person was drawing. Not on paper. On the wall itself. White dust covered slender blue fingers. Tiny particles drifted through the air beneath the emergency lights, like frozen snowflakes. The artist never looked away from the image taking shape. Ethan stopped a few feet behind her. A constellation spread across the metal surface. Dozens of stars. Tiny circles. Delicate lines connecting them. Some large. Some small. All arranged with surprising precision. The drawing stretched almost 6 feet wide. Not random. Not decorative. Intentional. The young alien girl finally sensed his presence. Her shoulders stiffened. The piece of chalk froze in her hand. Slowly she turned around. Violet eyes met his. Wide. Alert. Ready for disappointment. Ethan recognized that expression immediately. He had seen it in refugee camps from Earth to Titan. The look people wore when they expected kindness to come with conditions. Neither of them spoke. The station hummed around them. Warm air drifted through the corridor for the first time all night. The girl glanced toward the unfinished constellation, then toward the blank maintenance report hanging from Ethan's belt, as if waiting for him to call security, or demand she stop, or tell her the wall wasn't hers. Instead, Ethan looked back at the stars. Every line, every mark, every careful detail. Then he noticed something strange. One corner of the constellation had been erased recently, painted over, yet someone had drawn it again. Exactly the same. He looked back at the girl. She lowered her eyes. Not ashamed. Protective. Like she was guarding something precious. Something fragile. Something nobody else seemed to understand. And for reasons Ethan couldn't explain yet, he found himself staring at those stars much longer than necessary. The next evening, Ethan told himself he was only returning to Sector 12 to verify the heating system. The excuse sounded reasonable enough, even to him. Maintenance logs required follow-up inspections after a major repair. Protocol said so. Still, as he walked through the corridor carrying his tool bag, he knew the heat pipes were not the reason he was there. Haven 9 had entered artificial night cycle 2 hours earlier. Most of the station had settled into its usual rhythm of distant ventilation fans, muted conversations behind sealed doors, and the constant low vibration of engines keeping 20,000 lives suspended above the red planet below. The emergency lighting had switched from red to soft amber. Shadows stretched longer across the corridor walls. The place felt less like a shelter and more like a memory. Ethan rounded the corner and stopped. The constellation was larger. Much larger. The drawing now covered nearly the entire section of wall. New stars had appeared overnight. Delicate lines connected them into geometric patterns that looked almost architectural. Whoever had created them had remarkable patience. He set his tool bag down quietly. Lyra was already there, kneeling on the floor, one hand resting against the metal surface, the other moving slowly as she added another tiny circle to the expanding map. White dust covered the sleeve of her worn gray jacket. She glanced over her shoulder when she heard him approach. Her violet eyes narrowed slightly. Not fear this time. Caution. Recognition. Ethan offered a small nod. Good evening. No response. He had not expected one. Lyra turned back toward the wall and continued drawing. For several minutes neither spoke. The station seemed unusually quiet around them. Ethan found himself studying the constellation again. The patterns felt familiar somehow. Not because he understood them, because they looked deliberate, organized, like instructions written in a language he had never learned. His gaze moved to the chalk fragment in Lyra's hand. It was barely an inch long now, worn almost completely down. She noticed him looking. Slowly she opened her fingers and revealed the tiny piece of white chalk resting in her palm. Then she looked toward the wall, then toward him, as if apologizing for using the last of it. Ethan smiled despite himself. Wait here. Lyra blinked. He walked back down the corridor and disappeared around the corner. 2 minutes later, he returned carrying a small plastic container from his maintenance locker. He placed it gently on the floor beside her. Inside sat several pieces of colored chalk. Green, yellow, white, red, and one bright blue stick. The same shade as a summer sky over Earth. Lyra stared at the container. She did not move immediately. Her eyes traveled from the chalk to Ethan and back again. Something unreadable flickered across her face. Surprise perhaps, or disbelief. Eventually she reached forward. Her fingers hovered above the colors before selecting the blue one. She held it carefully, almost reverently. Ethan watched her turn it over in her hands. Then she looked at him again. This time her expression softened slightly. Not a smile. Not yet. But something close. She rose to her feet and stepped toward the wall. The blue chalk touched the metal surface. Slowly she drew a small circle near the edge of the constellation. Then another. Then a curved line connecting them. Ethan frowned. The new shapes looked different from everything else. Simpler. More personal. Lyra stepped aside and waited, as if inviting him to look closer. Ethan approached. Beneath the amber light, he studied the drawing. 2 circles connected by a single blue path. One large, one small. A journey between worlds. For the first time since meeting her, he realized the stars were not the most important part of the picture. The spaces between them were. The following night, Ethan arrived carrying no maintenance tools at all. The heating system was functioning perfectly. Every regulator in Sector 12 reported stable temperatures. Every circulation valve showed green status indicators. For once, nothing needed repair. Yet he found himself walking the same corridor anyway. The amber lights glowed softly overhead. Warm air drifted from the vents he had fixed 3 days earlier. Somewhere beyond the bulkheads, a cargo shuttle completed docking procedures with a distant metallic thud. Haven 9 continued breathing around him. Alive, restless, full of stories nobody had time to tell. Lyra was already there. She seemed to appear before the station lights fully settled into evening mode, as if she belonged to the quiet hours between shifts. Tonight the wall had changed again. The constellation now stretched nearly 12 feet across the corridor. New clusters had emerged near the upper corners. Thin blue pathways linked distant stars together like rivers flowing through darkness. Ethan stopped several feet away and simply looked. The drawing no longer resembled random artwork. It felt intentional, ancient, almost sacred. Lyra sat cross-legged beneath the largest cluster, sketching another line with careful precision. She glanced toward him as he approached. This time she did not freeze. She did not step away. Instead, she shifted slightly to make room beside her. Ethan smiled. I will take that as permission. He lowered himself onto the floor. The metal felt cool beneath his back. For a while neither moved. Neither spoke. They simply watched the wall. Ethan realized he had not spent this much time sitting quietly with another person in years. Life aboard Haven 9 moved fast. Repairs, reports, emergencies, endless schedules. Silence had become rare, valuable. Lyra reached into the container of chalk and selected a white piece. She drew a small symbol near one of the blue routes, a circle surrounded by 3 tiny marks. Then she pointed toward it. Ethan leaned forward. You want me to understand? She nodded once. He studied the symbol. A station. No reaction. A planet. Nothing. A city. Still nothing. Lyra tilted her head. Then she drew another version of the same symbol farther away. Then another. Then another. All connected by the blue pathways. Ethan frowned. His eyes followed the routes crossing between stars. Suddenly something clicked. Stops, he whispered. Lyra's eyes widened immediately. The smallest hint of excitement appeared on her face. Ethan sat up straighter. Not places. Waypoints. She nodded quickly. The first enthusiastic response he had seen from her. Ethan looked back at the wall. New understanding transformed everything. The stars were not decorations. The blue lines were not artistic choices. This was navigation. A map. An actual route through space. He stared at the enormous drawing stretching across the corridor. You are showing journeys. Another nod. Lyra reached for a yellow piece of chalk and circled one distant cluster near the edge of the wall. Her hand paused there, longer than anywhere else. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Something about that cluster mattered. She placed her fingertips against the yellow circle and lowered her gaze. The excitement disappeared. Sadness replaced it. Not dramatic sadness. Not tears. Something quieter. Older. Ethan knew that expression too. It was the look people carried when remembering a place they could no longer return to. The station lights dimmed slightly as night cycle deepened. Golden reflections danced across the chalk dust scattered on the floor. Ethan looked from the yellow circle to Lyra, then back again. Slowly, carefully, he reached into the chalk container. He selected the blue piece. Without speaking, he moved to an empty section near the lower edge of the wall. Lyra watched him closely. Ethan drew a small circle. Simple, uneven, human. Then beneath it, he wrote a single word. Earth. For several seconds, neither moved. The station hummed softly around them. Finally, Lyra stood. She walked toward the drawing. Her fingers brushed the yellow circle, then followed the blue route across the wall, past dozens of stars, past countless waypoints, until they rested gently on the little blue world Ethan had drawn. And for the first time since he met her, she smiled. Ethan spent the next morning thinking about a smile that had lasted less than 2 seconds. It felt ridiculous. Haven, 9 housed thousands of refugees. Entire families depended on systems he maintained every day. He had work orders stacked across 3 sectors and a coolant inspection scheduled before lunch. Yet his thoughts kept drifting back to the corridor in Sector 12, to the constellation, to the yellow circle, to the moment Lyra's guarded expression had finally softened. By evening, he found himself carrying something unusual through the station. Not repair equipment, not maintenance reports. A small projection tablet. The device was old, scratched along the edges, heavy by modern standards. He had almost thrown it away years earlier. Almost. The corridor was empty when he arrived. For a brief moment, disappointment settled in his chest. Then he noticed fresh chalk dust near the wall. Lyra appeared a minute later from a side passage carrying the now familiar container of colored chalk. She stopped when she saw him waiting. Her eyes moved to the projection tablet under his arm. Curiosity replaced caution immediately. Ethan lifted the device slightly. I brought something. Lyra tilted her head. He activated the screen. Blue light flickered across the corridor wall. Static danced for several seconds before a photograph appeared. Clouds, oceans, sunlight reflecting across water. Earth viewed from orbit. The image filled nearly 3 feet of empty wall space. Lyra stared, completely still. Ethan remembered seeing the same photograph for the first time as a child. His father had kept an old printed copy framed above the kitchen table. Back then it had seemed ordinary. Home always does until you leave it behind. Pacific Ocean, he said quietly. Western Hemisphere. Lyra stepped closer. Her violet eyes reflected blue light from the display. Slowly she reached out. Her fingertips hovered inches from the image but never touched it. Ethan smiled. I figured if I was going to put Earth on your map, I should at least show you what it looks like. The projection changed. Mountains appeared next. Snow-covered peaks rising above clouds. Then forests. Rivers. Desert canyons glowing gold beneath sunset. City lights visible from orbit. Photographs collected over centuries. Different places. Different seasons. One world. Lyra watched every image with absolute focus. Occasionally, she pointed toward details that interested her. A coastline. A mountain range. A flock of birds captured in flight. She never spoke. She did not need to. The conversation existed somewhere beyond words. Eventually, the final photograph faded. The corridor returned to amber light and shadows. For a moment, neither moved. Then Lyra suddenly knelt beside the wall. She selected a green piece of chalk and began drawing rapidly, faster than Ethan had ever seen. Curved lines appeared. Beneath the yellow circle. Branching shapes. Hills perhaps. Forest rivers. More details emerged around the star cluster she had marked earlier. Ethan crouched nearby and watched. 10 minutes passed. 15. When she finally stopped, the new drawing covered almost 4 feet of wall. It looked nothing like a navigation chart. It looked like a landscape. A home. Lyra sat back and studied it quietly. Ethan understood immediately. Your world. Her eyes met his. She nodded. Once. The gesture carried more emotion than any speech could have. Ethan looked closer. Tall crystalline structures rose beside rivers. Forests stretched across valleys beneath unfamiliar stars. Small circles marked settlements scattered across the landscape. The drawing felt alive. Loved. Remembered. Then he noticed one detail hidden near the edge of the image. A tiny figure standing beneath the stars. Alone. Ethan glanced toward Lyra. She lowered her eyes. The station hummed softly around them. Somewhere beyond the hull, Mars drifted through darkness. Neither spoke. Yet sitting there beside a chalk drawing on an old metal wall, Ethan realized something important. He had been showing Lyra pictures of Earth. Tonight, for the first time, she had shown him home in return. 3 days later, the wall had become impossible to ignore. Refugees passing through Sector 12 slowed down to look at it. Children pointed toward the colorful constellations stretching across the metal panels. Elderly travelers paused beside the chalk landscapes and exchanged quiet observations in languages Ethan could not understand. Somehow the corridor no longer felt forgotten. It felt alive. That should have been a good thing. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed. Ethan was replacing a sensor module near the junction terminal when his wrist communicator chimed. A priority maintenance message flashed across the screen. Supervisor Grant Mercer. Report to operations office immediately. Ethan sighed. That usually meant paperwork. He disliked paperwork almost as much as faulty air recyclers. 20 minutes later, he stepped into the operations office overlooking Haven 9's central docking ring. Massive observation windows revealed. Cargo vessels drifting silently against the blackness of space. Mars glowed beyond them like a distant ember. Grant Mercer stood beside a display terminal holding a digital report. The older man's expression already suggested trouble. You know why you are here? Mercer asked. Ethan glanced at the report. He already knew. The drawings. Mercer lowered the tablet. The wall is station property. It is also a hallway nobody cared about for 10 years. That is not the point. Ethan folded his arms. Then what is? Mercer hesitated. Complaints. Ethan blinked. Complaints. A few residents believe the artwork encourages unauthorized modifications of public areas. Ethan almost laughed. Children drawing stars is considered a threat now. Mercer rubbed his forehead. You know how regulations work. Ethan knew exactly how regulations worked. Regulations kept oxygen flowing. Regulations prevented disasters. Regulations also had a remarkable talent for crushing harmless things beneath endless procedure. What happens next? Ethan asked quietly. Mercer looked uncomfortable. Officially? The wall gets cleaned. The answer settled heavily inside Ethan's chest. Cleaned. Such a simple word. It sounded harmless. Yet he immediately pictured the yellow circle. The blue routes. The landscapes Lyra had recreated from memory. Entire worlds reduced to fresh white paint. Mercer finally sighed. Look, Ethan. I am giving you advance notice because I know you have been spending time down there. Maintenance crews are scheduled tomorrow evening. Ethan nodded once. Nothing else. He left the office carrying an unpleasant weight he could not shake. Sector 12 felt different when he arrived that night. The corridor remained warm. The amber lights still glowed softly overhead. The station still hummed with distant machinery. Yet something had changed. Perhaps it was only his mood. Lyra stood near the center of the mural, adding details to a cluster of stars. She immediately noticed his expression. Her chalk paused mid-stroke. Ethan forced a small smile that fooled neither of them. He walked toward the wall and sat on the floor beneath the projection tablet he had left mounted nearby. For several moments, neither moved. Finally, Lyra approached and settled beside him. She waited patiently. Ethan stared at the constellation. They want to remove it. The words sounded heavier aloud. Lyra remained still. He pointed toward the mural stretching across the corridor. All of it. Silence followed. Long enough for the ventilation system to cycle twice. Long enough for distant footsteps to echo somewhere beyond the intersection. Ethan expected disappointment, anger, sadness. Instead, Lyra simply looked at the wall. Then she looked at him. Slowly, she lifted the blue chalk. She pressed it into his hand. Ethan frowned. What am I supposed to do with this? Lyra stood and walked toward an empty section of metal beyond the existing mural. The space remained completely blank, untouched, waiting. She pointed toward it, then toward the chalk in his hand. Then she stepped back. Ethan stared at the empty wall. Understanding arrived gradually. She was not worried about losing what already existed. She was asking him to help create what came next. For the first time all evening, he smiled. Real smiles often begin as small things. Sometimes they start with a memory. Sometimes with a friend. Sometimes with a single piece of blue chalk held beneath a sky that no longer belonged to only one world. The next evening arrived with the quiet certainty of an approaching storm that nobody could see. Maintenance crews were scheduled to repaint the corridor in less than 24 hours. Official notices had already appeared on nearby information panels. Temporary closure. Surface restoration. Standard procedure. The words looked harmless. They always did. Ethan stood beneath one of the notices and stared at it for several seconds before tearing his attention away. Across the corridor, Lyra was waiting beside the mural. The blue chalk remained tucked behind one ear. Somehow that small detail made him smile. You know, he said as he approached, most people carry communication devices. You carry art supplies. Lyra responded with the faintest lift of one eyebrow. It was becoming her version of humor. Ethan sat beside the blank section she had pointed out the previous night. The untouched metal panel stretched nearly 8 feet long. A fresh canvas. Around them, the existing mural glowed softly beneath the amber station lights. Stars. Routes. Landscapes. Memories. Entire worlds preserved in colored dust. Ethan turned the blue chalk between his fingers. I should warn you, he said. I am not an artist. Lyra folded her arms and waited. The expression on her face suggested she had already reached her own conclusions about that. Ethan laughed quietly. Then he pressed the chalk against the wall. At first he drew awkwardly. Simple outlines. A curved shoreline. A mountain ridge. A river cutting through open terrain. Nothing particularly impressive. Yet as the lines expanded, old memories surfaced. Summers in Oregon. Camping trips with his father. Early mornings beside lakes wrapped in mist. Places he had not visited in decades. Places that still lived somewhere inside him. He continued drawing. Trees appeared. Hills. Clouds drifting above distant peaks. Lyra watched every line. Occasionally, she stepped forward and added details of her own. Strange crystal formations unlike anything on Earth. Elegant towers rising between forests. Curved bridges spanning rivers. Different worlds began blending together across the wall. Human landscapes touching alien landscapes. Earth colors merging with memories from a distant star. Neither seemed out of place anymore. Time slipped past unnoticed. Eventually, footsteps echoed from the far intersection. Ethan glanced up. Several refugees had gathered quietly nearby. An elderly woman wrapped in a gray thermal blanket. 2 children carrying school tablets. A cargo worker still wearing reflective dock gear. They stood watching without interrupting. More people arrived. Nobody spoke loudly. Nobody complained. They simply observed. The corridor felt different again. Not like a hallway. Like a community gathering around a fire. One child finally stepped forward holding a piece of yellow chalk. He looked toward Ethan uncertainly. Ethan smiled. Want to help? The boy nodded immediately. Minutes later, others joined. A small green moon appeared near one corner of the mural. Someone added a comet. Another refugee drew a tiny transport ship traveling between stars. The wall expanded beyond any single story, beyond any single world. Lyra moved among them silently, guiding nervous hands with gentle gestures. For the first time, Ethan saw her interacting comfortably with strangers. Not hiding, not watching from a distance. Belonging. The realization stayed with him long after the chalk dust settled. Several hours later, the crowd finally dispersed. The corridor grew quiet once more. Ethan stepped back to admire the finished section. Dozens of people had contributed. Hundreds of details filled the wall now. It was imperfect, uneven, beautiful. Lyra stood beside him studying the result. Then her expression changed. She was looking beyond the mural toward the corridor entrance. Ethan followed her gaze. Two maintenance workers had just entered carrying paint equipment and surface cleaning tools. They stopped when they saw the wall. The station hummed softly around them. Nobody spoke. For a long moment, the only sound came from distant ventilation fans moving warm air through Haven 9's aging heart. The two maintenance workers stood motionless beneath the amber lights. Paint sprayers hung at their sides. Cleaning equipment rested against the corridor wall. Neither seemed quite sure what to do next. Ethan understood the feeling. Looking at the mural now felt different from any previous night. It was no longer a collection of drawings created by one silent refugee. It had become something larger. A map of memories. A record of journeys. A conversation stretching across species, languages, and worlds. One of the workers finally stepped closer. His identification badge read Nolan Pierce. He studied the stars covering the upper panels. The blue routes. The landscapes. The tiny transport ship a child had drawn near the center. I was supposed to erase all this, he admitted quietly. Ethan nodded. I know. Nolan looked around the corridor. New details emerged everywhere. Handprints hidden among distant constellations. Small signatures tucked beside moons and rivers. Families had left pieces of themselves behind. The worker exhaled slowly. This is going to be a difficult report. His partner laughed softly. That might be the understatement of the year. For a brief moment, tension lifted. Then another sound echoed from the intersection. Footsteps. Several sets. Ethan turned. Supervisor Grant Mercer appeared accompanied by two administrative staff members carrying data tablets. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Beside him, Lyra became very still. The familiar caution returned to her eyes. Mercer approached the mural without speaking. The corridor seemed unusually quiet. Even the ventilation system sounded distant. Dozens of residents lingered nearby, pretending not to watch. Mercer stopped near the center of the wall. His gaze traveled across the artwork slowly. Methodically. No expression revealed what he was thinking. Seconds stretched into nearly a minute. Finally, he looked toward Ethan. You did not mention half the station was involved. Ethan folded his arms. You never asked. One corner of Mercer's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Not quite disapproval. Something in between. The administrator beside him checked a tablet. Technically, this remains unauthorized modification of station property. Nobody seemed surprised by that statement. Rules rarely disappeared simply because people wished they would. Mercer continued studying the mural. His attention settled briefly on the landscape Lyra had drawn from memory. The crystal forests. The rivers. The distant settlements beneath unfamiliar stars. Then he noticed something Ethan had almost forgotten. A tiny figure standing alone near the edge of that world. The smallest drawing on the entire wall. Mercer stared at it longer than expected. Who made this section? He asked. Ethan glanced toward Lyra. She lowered her eyes immediately. Mercer followed the movement and finally noticed her standing nearby. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then something changed. Recognition flickered across his face. Not recognition of the girl herself. Recognition of grief. Of homesickness. Of loss. Emotions that looked remarkably similar no matter which world someone came from. Mercer sighed. The sound carried years of paperwork and responsibility. My grandfather came here during the Titan relocation program, he said unexpectedly. Spent 20 years talking about mountains he would never see again. The corridor remained silent. Nobody interrupted. Every evening, he sketched them from memory. Mercer looked back toward the mural. He said forgetting was what scared him most. Ethan watched the older man carefully. Lyra did too. The administrator cleared her throat. Supervisor, maintenance scheduling requires a decision. Mercer took a long breath. Then another. Finally, he reached toward the tablet she carried and signed a document. The screen flashed green. Authorization approved. The corridor restoration project is canceled, he said. Confusion spread across several faces. Mercer continued before anyone could ask questions. Effective immediately, Sector 12 is being redesignated as a cultural reflection space. The words hung in the air. Nobody moved. Then Nolan lowered his paint sprayer and grinned. Someone near the back began applauding softly. Another joined. Then another. The sound grew gradually throughout the corridor. Not loud. Not overwhelming. Warm. Human. Alien. Shared. Amid the applause, Ethan looked toward Lyra. Tears did not fill her eyes. She did not laugh. She simply placed one hand against the mural and closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening to a distant home finally answering back. The announcement spread through Haven 9 faster than any official bulletin ever could. By the following week, people were visiting Sector 12 from every corner of the station. Families arrived during meal breaks. Dock workers stopped by before night shifts. Students brought notebooks and spent hours sketching details from the mural. What had once been an ignored corridor now felt like the quiet center of the entire station. Ethan noticed the change everywhere. The atmosphere seemed lighter. Conversations lasted longer. Strangers greeted one another more often. Even the maintenance requests coming through his terminal somehow sounded less urgent. Perhaps nothing had changed. Or perhaps people simply needed a place that reminded them they belonged somewhere. One evening, Ethan arrived carrying a sealed storage container nearly 3 feet long. The moment Lyra spotted it, curiosity appeared on her face. He set the container carefully on the floor beneath the mural. "I found something in archive storage," he explained. "Something nobody has used in years." Lyra crouched beside him as he released the latches. The lid opened with a metallic click. Inside rested dozens of transparent star charts printed on flexible polymer sheets. Ancient navigation records. Historical maps. Long obsolete. Beautiful. Amber light reflected across the delicate patterns etched into their surfaces. Lyra lifted one sheet carefully. Her eyes widened. Tiny coordinates covered the material from edge to edge. Routes. Systems. Distances. Entire regions of explored space frozen in data. Ethan smiled. The archive department was throwing them away. Her expression immediately suggested she found that decision deeply offensive. Ethan laughed. That was my reaction too. Together, they began comparing the charts against the mural. At first it felt like a simple exercise. Then Ethan noticed something strange. One cluster of stars appeared repeatedly throughout the old records. The same cluster Lyra had highlighted weeks earlier with the yellow chalk. His smile faded slightly. He examined another chart. Then another. The pattern remained consistent. The route existed in every historical archive. Yet modern navigation systems listed the entire region as inactive, unused, forgotten. Ethan frowned. That is odd. Lyra stepped closer. He pointed toward the coordinates, then toward the matching section of her mural. Understanding flashed across her face instantly. She hurried to the wall and retrieved a white piece of chalk. New symbols appeared beside the yellow circle, more detailed than anything she had drawn before. Ethan studied them carefully. Several resembled the waypoints from the archive maps. Others looked entirely unfamiliar. Then Lyra pointed first at the charts, next at the mural, finally toward herself. Ethan stared at the sequence. A realization arrived gradually. You know these routes. Her expression brightened. A quick nod. Ethan looked back at the coordinates. Not because you studied them. Another nod. He felt a chill despite the warm air flowing through the corridor. Because you traveled them. Lyra became very still. Then she reached out and touched the yellow circle once more. The gesture carried years of meaning. Years of memory. Ethan suddenly understood why the mural felt so precise. Why every star occupied an exact position. Why every route connected perfectly. These were not stories she had heard. They were places she remembered. Journeys she had lived. The station hummed softly around them. Far beyond the hull, stars filled the darkness in every direction. Ethan looked from the ancient charts to the silent girl standing beside them. For weeks he had believed he was helping someone preserve fragments of a lost home. Now another possibility emerged. Perhaps Lyra had been preserving something far more important than memory. Perhaps she had been protecting knowledge nobody else realized still existed. 2 weeks later, representatives from the Station Archive Division arrived in Sector 12 carrying scanners, reference databases, and enough curiosity to fill the corridor twice over. What began as a forgotten wall drawing had become the subject of formal study. Historical navigation specialists compared Lyra's mural against records that had not been opened in decades. Astronomers examined coordinates. Cartographers checked route alignments. Every day new questions appeared. Yet one fact remained unchanged. The mural was accurate. Remarkably accurate. Ethan often watched from a distance while experts stood beneath the amber lights tracing pathways with astonished expressions. Several routes marked on the wall connected sectors of space modern systems no longer monitored. Others referenced settlements officially classified as abandoned generations earlier. But archive records told a more complicated story. One afternoon, a senior researcher approached Ethan holding a data tablet. "Do you realize what she preserved?" the woman asked quietly. Ethan glanced toward Lyra. She sat near the mural, adding small details to a distant cluster of stars. Not completely, he admitted. The researcher looked back at the wall. Entire migration corridors, refugee routes, historical safe passages, used during planetary evacuations. Most of this knowledge disappeared when the old navigation networks were retired. Ethan stared at the mural. Thousands of lines. Thousands of memories. Suddenly, he understood. Lyra had never been drawing decorations. She had been protecting a map. A living archive carried inside memory when databases failed and records vanished. That evening, the station administration organized a gathering in Sector 12. Nothing formal. No grand ceremony. Just residents sharing food, stories, and time beneath the stars painted across the corridor. Families arrived carrying folding chairs. Children brought fresh boxes of chalk. Someone projected distant nebula photographs onto the ceiling. Laughter drifted through the station like warm air. Ethan stood near the back of the crowd, watching everything unfold. Haven 9 felt different now. Less like a place people passed through. More like a place where people belonged. Eventually, Supervisor Mercer stepped forward, holding a small plaque. The conversations quieted. A few months ago, he began. This corridor was scheduled for repainting. Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. Mercer smiled. Today it becomes a permanent cultural archive maintained by the station and protected for future generations. Applause followed. Warm and genuine. Yet Ethan barely heard it. His attention rested on Lyra. She stood near the center of the mural, surrounded by people who no longer viewed her as a stranger. Children waved. Elderly residents greeted her. Researchers asked questions. She answered most of them the same way she always had. With gestures. With drawings. With patience. Then something unexpected happened. Mercer turned toward her. There is one thing everyone still wants to know, he said gently. Why did you begin drawing here in the first place? Silence settled across the corridor. Dozens of faces waited. Lyra looked at the mural, then at the stars overhead projected onto the ceiling. Finally, her gaze found Ethan standing quietly near the back. For a moment, nobody moved. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft from long disuse, barely louder than a whisper. Yet every person heard it. Because I thought. Nobody remembered. The words lingered in the air. Simple. Honest. Powerful. Lyra looked toward the blue circle Ethan had drawn weeks earlier. The small world remained surrounded by stars and pathways connecting countless homes together. A faint smile touched her face. Then someone drew his home beside mine. Nobody rushed to speak after that. Nobody needed to. Beyond the observation windows, stars stretched endlessly across the darkness. Their light reflected softly on the mural, on the people gathered beneath it, and on 2 small worlds connected by a single blue line. Sometimes hope does not arrive as a rescue ship or a miracle. Sometimes it arrives as a piece of chalk, an empty wall, and a person willing to say, without words, that no one has to remember alone.